This is the presentation for democracy in the United States, and my name is Jake Steinbach. I will be presenting on Executive Order 9066. It is most famously the executive order that essentially allowed the military to place Japanese Americans in internment camps during World War II. So the introduction, President Roosevelt, FDR, signed it into effect in 1942 on February 19th. And he felt this necessary because of the Pearl Harbor attacks and the kind of growing threat from Japan and all the other powers in Europe and Asia going against the United States. But we'll get into that. So essentially what the executive order did is it permitted and authorized the internment of all Japanese Americans and resident aliens from Japan. So that means all people that were in the United States of Japanese descent, even if they were American citizens and even if they were naturalized American citizens, which means they were born in the United States and didn't even immigrate from there. It also included immigrants, like they said, resident aliens, quote unquote, from Japan. And it also included some groups of Italian and German residents, which a lot of people don't really know, but about 5,000 Italians and 10,000 Germans were also interned because mainly of this FBI report of where those people were. It was generally confined to the West Coast because that is where the most Japanese Americans were. And so, all of those groups were interned for the majority of World War II. The dictionary defines intern as to be the state of being confined as a prisoner, especially for political or military reasons. So that's where this comes into play. It was solely for what FDR and the government and his military advisors thought were military reasons. Not necessarily political, but also FDR felt a lot of pressure from the American people and people within his government to do this, and so in that way he felt political pressure. So the background and origin, that it was thought necessary to the actions of World War II by the Japanese military, so specifically Pearl Harbor, but there were suspected spies and actions that led to pressure FDR. Most of this was hearsay, and it was not necessarily backed up by facts or any concrete data. But at the time, there were a lot of people thinking that the Japanese were the enemy, and any Japanese people in the United States were spies or military officers, and so this pressured FDR into enacting this executive order. So it led to a lot of hysteria. Pearl Harbor obviously did, and people were understandably upset, but kind of the hysteria of that led to this irrational fear of all Japanese peoples in the United States. Let's see. And so then it led to 120,000 Japanese families that were forced out of their homes across the West Coast. Later we'll see a map, and it essentially runs from Washington down to Arizona and parts of New Mexico. They did this mainly because in those areas there were a lot of naval bases and military operations, but also because of that FBI report that I mentioned that had a large number of Japanese and Japanese Americans living in the West Coast that they felt were enemies of the state. So a little more background. I just explained why, but this is a little more specific. A large number of Japanese living close to oil wells, cargo shipyards, and naval bases near Los Angeles and San Pedro, respectively. So this led to them wanting it to be more West Coast centric rather than going across the country with these internment camps. So the Japanese were forced to register, even if they were born in the United States. So they had to register as a Japanese American and not just an American. And so this brought a lot of comparisons to the Holocaust and Jewish people having to register as Jewish and not just German citizens. And so they were asked to leave their spots voluntarily, but after they left, they didn't really know where they were going, but they were sent to internment camps. And of those interned, there were 2 out of 3 of them were natural-born citizens. So that's kind of crazy that the United States was just locking up their own citizens. And then some were forced to sleep in horse stalls. We're going to more just terrible conditions that they went through, but it was really, really bad conditions because the military had to build this infrastructure up in a short amount of time in order to get all of these Japanese Americans in a small, secluded space in which they could monitor them and make sure that they, quote unquote, weren't spies. So this is the evacuation program in the map. You can see that some of it stretches into Utah, but the majority of them lead into the West Coast and near San Pedro and Los Angeles. So it's mainly there, but there are a few up north. There's a military area up north, which is like 1, 2, and then you can see some of them are numbered down. And those are the different concentration camps. The military areas were established by Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, who we'll talk about later. But he essentially ordered Military 1, and then Military 2, Military 3, and Military 4. And so that just kept going down and down and down and spreading more eastern. So the settings, it started with Pearl Harbor, and then a report by the FBI, which I mentioned. The setting was the West Coast, but this affected almost only Japanese Americans and not Italians or Germans. The reason was clear, but the irrational fear and push from the public seemed to prompt FDR the most, and so that was kind of the characteristics that led to this. The implementation was taken from homes and buses, so they would have businesses and homes all across the West Coast, and then they would be bused to these different internment camps. They taken to buildings a little better than big tents. They were built by the federal government, sometimes in less than a day. And they were a little bit inland of the coast because they didn't want them to be on the coast near the shipping yards and the naval barracks and stuff. And forced labor was a common thing, such as making camouflage for the United States Army, and they didn't get paid for this at all. They were just essentially forced labor and slave labor. They lived in army barracks with army rations for nearly 3 years, including a lot of young children who were forced to eat specifically just army rations and live in army barracks. So they were taken from their homes and put into this terrible situation. So the characteristics included, one thing that I discovered was the budget of this was essentially limitless because it was structured towards the military. It was a military operation, and so they took from the military budget. And during World War II, the military budget was not huge, but it was being utilized as well as it could. So Japanese families leaving did not want to leave their businesses and homes, but they were militarily forced to. So some of them voluntarily went because they thought that they would be persecuted otherwise, but some of them had to be forced out. The effectiveness of the executive order is unquestionable, except for ethically, people were military forced out very quickly. Like I said, Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt ordered forced evacuation, and then Congress made it a $5,000 fine not to evacuate. And today, I did the calculation, due to inflation, that would be around $90,000 today. So it's a crazy statistic that they had to pay $5,000, and some people really did because they refused to get on these buses and go somewhere that wasn't their home. So the main opposition to this in the government was the Department of Justice, who believed that the ethics of the internment was questionable, especially for American citizens, but this was largely ignored because it was a military action. So a lot of private military actions aren't aren't subject to the same judicial process as any other actions, such as congressional actions, especially because it was an executive order. Small opposition groups, such as American Friends Service Committee and Socialist Party leader Norman Thomas, both protested and started a petition, but the petition only got about 200 signatures. It didn't really go anywhere. And so there aren't many people that are opposing this. Japanese journalists tried to go against it by comparing it to Hitler's internment camps, like I mentioned before, but nothing happened. And then there were actually more Japanese Americans who tried to purposefully avoid internment, and they had a curfew when they were interned, and they purposefully neglected the curfew. And then when they tried to take the internment to the courts, but they were all unsuccessful, just because the weight of an executive order is so heavy that it's really hard to overturn. So these are the outcomes of it. The last camp was closed in 1946, so essentially close to the end of the war. And so if you think about it, the first camp was 1942, and so they were there for at least 3 years. And then it wasn't officially repealed, 9066, until 1976, but that was more of a formality in order to kind of gain the trust back of Japanese Americans, and then eventually to grant reparations, which Congress did, of $20,000 to 80,000 Japanese Americans. If you think about it, the penalty for not going to intern was at that time like around $80,000 to $90,000, and so 20,000 is little, but some reparations were made. And then there was also a study that I looked at where the relocating of families to poorer areas had a lasting effect on future generations' wealth and success. So the families that were located in poorer areas rather than wealthy areas had much less success and lower earnings than those that were interned in a wealthy area. And so that is a future concern and outcome. And then current and future implications. The current comparison was the refugee crisis and Trump's quote-unquote Muslim ban. And so it's just kind of a cautionary tale to how they handle, how the American public and the American government handle citizens whose native countries is seemingly anti-American. So even though a lot of military operations go on in Muslim-based countries, that doesn't mean that people in the United States who are even citizens or even naturalized citizens who were born here are anti-American as well. And so we have to be careful with that. And then this internment process is simply a reminder that the American government should watch out when it comes to that kind of thing. And these are references that I used, and that is all.